Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Fundy Royal.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a privilege to be able to speak in this House this evening on what is a very important matter. Today we are debating the unprecedented measures this government is taking by invoking the never-before-used Emergencies Act. I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that there's no place in law for the Emergencies Act. What I'm arguing, and many others, of course, is that it is a completely disproportionate tool to effectively deal with these protests, and that the government's rationale for using it has way too many plot holes to even begin to enumerate. The predecessor legislation to the Emergencies Act, the War Measures Act, was used only 3 times. Once in World War I, once in World War II, and then in the FLQ crisis in the 70s. In order to even think about invoking the Emergencies Act, we have to look at the context in which its predecessor legislation was used and how rare, in fact, it was implemented. Number one, there has to be a national emergency. And we look at how the Act itself defines a national emergency. The Act describes a national emergency as an urgent and critical situation of a temporary measure. Now, we all know that the protests are not an urgent and critical situation of a temporary measure. I'm sure that the Prime Minister would have jumped into action 20 days ago if that was indeed the case. Regarding the Act's requirement that a national emergency be of a temporary measure, well, that part I can agree with, because the situation has been so temporary, in fact, that all of the blockades at international border between Canada and the U.S. have already been cleared before the Emergency Act was ever implemented, completely without the benefit of this legislation. The definition goes on to say that a national emergency seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it. Let's be honest, Madam Speaker, the truckers parked outside of Parliament today do not seriously endanger the lives of Canadians. And again, when it comes to international border crossings, the provinces have both the capacity and the authority to bring that to the end, and indeed they already have. The Act goes on to describe a national emergency as one that seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. That cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. If an emergency does not fit that description, then the Emergencies Act is not to be used. If a few hundred parked trucks pose a threat to the preservation of the sovereignty and security of Canada, one of the greatest countries in the world, a G7 country, that's a sobering testament of this government's dismal and failed leadership, leaving our country so vulnerable that its very existence could be called into question by a group of protesters on Wellington Street. I think it's very clear to all members in this House when we look at this through the vantage point that we have of being here in Ottawa that the threshold for a national emergency simply has not been met. But for argument's sake, let's say that the Prime Minister and his entire Liberal caucus truly and sincerely believe that the trucks parked on the street just outside these doors are a real emergency requiring unprecedented action from the federal government. To that, I would just have to say, what a sad state of affairs. If this is what an emergency looks like to this Liberal government, what incredibly privileged lives they must lead. When I think of the dealings that my own constituents in Fundy Royal have had over the past 2 years, facing dire ramifications and consequences of lockdowns. Back home, an emergency looks like a gym owner who's lost their business after 2 years of personal sacrifices in hopes of keeping their business afloat. An emergency can look like the single mom who has lost her job because of this government's vaccine mandate and then had that same government tell her cruelly that she couldn't collect employment insurance. Ultimately, Liberals are trying to use unprecedented emergency powers to respond to an event that doesn't even meet the threshold of a national emergency, as described in the Act itself. But while the emergency the Liberals say they are trying to address is not an actual emergency, the consequences and infringements on the civil liberties that we so dearly hold as Canadians and our rights as Canadians, the consequences are very real. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association had stated yesterday that the government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act. They also warn of the threat facing our democracy and civil liberties if the Emergencies Act is inappropriately applied, as it clearly is in this case. The BC Civil Liberties Association just today called on Liberal members and all members of this House to vote against this and to revoke, for the Prime Minister to revoke the Emergencies Act. Crisis that we faced as a nation without invoking the War Measures Act or the Emergency Act include, in 1990, the Oka crisis, a 78-day standoff between Mohawk protesters and law enforcement and the Canadian Armed Forces. In 2006, when a group of extremists, now known as the Toronto 18, plotted to carry out violent attacks here on Parliament Hill. In 2010, when the G20 protest turns to riots in Canada's largest city, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damages, Toronto's chief of police at the time was none other than the Liberal Minister of Emergency Preparedness currently. And it wasn't invoked on October 22nd, 2014, when many members of this House will remember a terrorist attack on Parliament Hill and on the War Memorial, which killed Corporal Nathan Cirillo before Centre Block itself was stormed. These were serious and at times fatal incidents that were entirely more dangerous and destructive than the truckers parked outside. The government invoking the Emergencies Act at this time just does not add up. The Emergency Act bypasses the democratic process. We cannot become complacent and allow these unprecedented powers to become a tool of government to shut down dissent that it doesn't like. Civil liberties, the rule of law, and democratic norms are never guaranteed. These principles require constant vigilance to defend. Canada was built on the foundation of these principles, and we cannot allow cracks to form. 2 days ago, I met with a man who immigrated to Canada from Romania. He had tears in his eyes, and he said, "This is a sad day for me." He lost his father to the Romanian regime under a brutal dictator, and he came to Canada in hopes to find freedom. And he recognizes, coming from a totalitarian regime where you are persecuted for your political beliefs, he recognizes what he sees here. It's hard to imagine what it must feel like to live in a country where you're not allowed to think or speak freely under the threat of persecution. But this gentleman I spoke with knows it all too well, and to see the division being sowed by this Prime Minister and the great lengths he is going to stomp out dissenting opinions is much too familiar. That's what this is. The Prime Minister is trying to eradicate any opinions that don't match his. This is a political crisis for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's instinct, unfortunately, we've all seen it in this House over and over, as recently as yesterday, his instinct is to divide. We know that not everyone who disagrees with this government is a racist, a misogynist, or a white supremacist, but it's a lot better for him if everybody thinks that. Just yesterday in this House, the Prime Minister accused a young Jewish member of Parliament of standing with swastikas. You may be wondering what triggered him to make such a disgusting statement. The member from Thornhill had dared to ask the Prime Minister when he lost his way, since he stated in 2015 that if Canadians are going to trust their government needs to trust Canadians. It speaks volumes that pointing out his own hypocrisy sent the Prime Minister into this rage. The Prime Minister has no problem joining in protests that are promoting ideology that he agrees with. We all know this in this House. When he agrees with it, it would be a good look for his brand, then he's there. But now that the protests don't align with his views, he's going for the nuclear option by invoking the Emergencies Act. The thing about being the leader of a free and fair democracy like Canada is that you don't get to pick and choose who gets to speak out and on what issues. The Prime Minister does not get to unilaterally suppress civil liberties of people he doesn't like. That, Madam Speaker, is what dictators do. All Canadians should be concerned by the actions of this Prime Minister and his Liberal government. All Canadians should be concerned when a group is targeted by the federal government for their political beliefs. And indeed, all Canadians should be concerned by the precedent being set by this government. And I will be proud to vote in opposition to this government overreach. Thank you.
So the point of order. The Honourable Government Whip. The Honourable Whip of the Official Opposition.
Well, I like the way you think, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, in accordance with Standing Order 43-2A, I would like to indicate that the remaining Conservative Party of Canada caucus speaking slots are hereby divided by 2.
I need to space my... Excuse me. Perfect. That's good. The questions et commentaires. The
questions and comments.
Point d'ordre. The honourable member for.
On a point of order.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a point of order. Sorry, I heard point of order. Okay. Questions et commentaires. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I've heard the words of my colleague on the other side of the floor, and so I have a few questions. As a Jewish member of Parliament myself and a descendant of survivors of the Holocaust as well, I, like many Canadians, were shocked to see Nazi flags, Confederate flags, dismayed and angry and hurt, horribly hurt. So how many Nazi flags does it take? How many donors from the Capitol riots, it's 1,100 and counting, who have donated to these illegal blockades? How many guns need to be seized? How much vitriol do we have to see of honk honk, which is an acronym for Hail Hitler, do we need to see by these protesters on social media? How many times do we have to see clear indicators that what is out there is not about the hard 2 years that every Canadian has suffered, but is it about something much deeper and darker and uglier that is threatening the stability of this House, the work that we do as legislators each and every day for our constituents, the democracy that we have to uphold? When will it be an emergency for you and your colleagues across the floor?
The honourable member knows full well that she needs to address the questions and comments to the chair, and I've been trying to signal her because there's other people who need to ask questions as well. So the honourable member for Fundy Royal.
Well, thanks, Madam Speaker. And clearly, all members in this House denounce any anti-Semitism in all of its kind. But when we look out, when I look at the people that have come here to protest, and Conservatives have been saying that it's time to move on. It's time for the trucks to go. We've been saying that. But what is very clear is the Emergencies Act is an absolutely inappropriate tool, seizing the bank accounts of individuals that you disagree with because of their political beliefs. It's unprecedented and it's wrong.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Abitibi-Témiscamingue.